Hey guys. Tonight we slip quietly through the pine-scented gates of Yildiz Palace, where the carpets are thick enough to muffle footsteps, and the silence feels just a little too aware of itself. You glide past the outer gardens, duck beneath low lamps casting amber halos on marble floors, and there he is, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, standing alone in the middle of a room lined with books and brass astrolabes. His eyes scan the window, then the door, then nothing. He's always scanning, because you're not just stepping into the Ottoman Empire tonight. You're stepping into a mind that never sleeps, a palace that watches its own walls, and an era so unstable that you probably won't survive this without at least a few reality checks along the way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, say a train station in Kuala Lumpur or your grandmother's couch in Nairobi, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love knowing where this weird little bedtime caravan ends up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk a few steps behind the Sultan now. It's the 1890s, give or take a few coups. Outside the palace walls, the Ottoman Empire is fraying like a badly sewn kaftan. But inside these cedar-lined rooms, Abdul Hamid moves like a man convinced he can still hold the stitching together. The palace isn't Topkapi anymore. The old center of sultanic power had grown too exposed, too ceremonial. Yildiz is different. Nestled higher up, deeper into the hillside, it's a palace built not for parades, but for retreat, built for isolation, which, of course, suits Abdul Hamid perfectly. You shuffle past a reception hall filled with too many chairs, none of which are ever used, and into the library. It's his sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling volumes in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, French, shelves sagging under the weight of politics, poetry, Islamic theology, and European philosophy. He's read most of them. Not skimmed, read. This isn't a ruler who decorates with books for show. You run your finger along a spine and pull out something dense, a French treatise on liberal democracy. Hilariously ironic, since this man had the Ottoman parliament suspended longer than it was ever active. But that's the contradiction you're stepping into. Abdul Hamid believes in ideas, so long as they remain safely inside books. Let people read too much, and they start asking questions. And once they start asking questions, they start forming clubs. And once they form clubs, they start writing pamphlets. And once there are pamphlets, well, the empire collapses and someone has to hang for it. That's the slippery slope he sees in every dog-eared page. Right now, you're watching him pace a little. There's no audience today. No viziers presenting endless trays of bad news. Just the faint rustle of pages and the creak of his boots on polished parquet. He's thinking about Germany again. Probably. His favorite pen pal is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who treats him like a mix between a chess partner and a slightly older, more anxious uncle. They exchange letters full of pleasantries, veiled threats, and ideas for railroads that might one day bind the Islamic world together. The Germans love him, because he's desperate. The French barely tolerate him. And the British, well, they're busy eating the empire alive with a fork and knife, starting from the edges and working inward. But inside this moment, here with the Sultan and the lamps and the books, time slows. You realize that Abdul Hamid's genius isn't in speeches or military conquests. Those were never his strengths. It's in endurance. In survival. He's the last Ottoman ruler who manages to delay the inevitable for decades through sheer vigilance, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. You sit with him now as a messenger delivers news. Another province has issued a grievance. Maybe it's Egypt. Maybe it's Macedonia. It doesn't matter. The details change, but the pattern remains. And yet, he never reacts immediately. He listens. He writes something in a tiny notebook. He'll think about it tomorrow, or 3 days from now, when his informants report back with the rumors behind the rumor. Because here's a not-so-fun fact. Abdul Hamid operated what was probably the most elaborate personal intelligence network of his era. Hundreds, possibly thousands of eyes and ears reported back to him daily. Government officials, low-level clerks, disgruntled butlers, market gossips. Even the imam giving Friday sermons might be repeating lines that Abdul Hamid himself wrote. The palace walls don't just have ears, they have opinions. It makes for a lonely life, to be honest. You might imagine a sultan surrounded by concubines and fountains and dancing shadows. But Abdul Hamid is a devout, austere man. He's married, sure, but he lives more like a monk than a playboy. His pleasures are quiet. Garden walks, long baths, fine calligraphy. Oh, and photographs. He loves photographs. Has them sent from every part of the empire. Maybe he thinks if he can capture everything, he can control it. That if he surrounds himself with images of stability, the illusion might hold. It's wishful thinking, obviously. Historians still argue whether this obsession with photography was strategic, an attempt to document and understand his vast dominion, or just another symptom of his compulsive need to monitor. But as you flip through an album of dusty prints, you feel the tension. A man trying to freeze time while time is clawing at the door. You move now into his private hammam, the royal bathhouse. It's steamy and quiet, tiled in blues and whites, so intense they seem to hum. The sultan bathes in silence, always alone, or with only the most trusted attendants. It's the only place where even his paranoia takes a nap. But even here, he never stays long. Too vulnerable, too exposed. And now you understand. Everything in Abdul Hamid's world, every corridor, every protocol, every servant, has been designed not for comfort, but for control. And control, as you're beginning to realize, is his religion. The palace, in all its stillness, is like a giant chessboard. Every visitor a pawn, every telegram a trap. And yet somehow, it all remains delicately balanced. At least for now. Because as we both know, this quiet can't last forever. You don't get to become a sultan without being a little strange, and Abdul Hamid's strangeness starts early. You're there now, barely 7 years old, walking through the opulent, over-scented halls of the Dolmabahce Palace, the kind of place where the chandeliers have their own security details and mirrors seem like they're judging you. The other boys, princes, and half-brothers race through the corridors with toy swords and too much sugar in their bloodstreams. But not you. You sit cross-legged in a corner, nose buried in an Arabic manuscript, trying to translate an obscure verse of Ibn Khaldun. You're a sickly child, honestly, prone to fevers and prone to disappearing into books even faster. Your tutors come and go, some terrified of your seriousness, others oddly hopeful that this pale, quiet boy might one day understand the empire better than the men currently running it into the ground. You're not athletic like your cousins. You're not charismatic like your brother Murad, who can charm a room with just his mustache. But you're something else entirely. Observant. And in this family, being observant is like being armed. You overhear things. You notice which uncles are suddenly not invited to dinner anymore. You spot the way the viziers whisper when your father, Sultan Abdul Hamid, isn't looking. He was a reformer, the kind who wanted to drag the Ottoman Empire into the 19th century, even if it kicked and screamed the whole way. Abdul Hamid started the Tanzimat reforms, secular schools, legal codes, even a new flag. But his court? A circus of excess. Western clothes, opera nights, champagne. It was Versailles with fewer wigs and more carpets. And little Abdul Hamid? He didn't buy into the glitz. He learned to smile and nod, sure, but deep down, he was quietly cataloging every wasted coin, every broken promise, every minister who said one thing and signed another. There's a bit of bitter foreshadowing in that childhood, and you can feel it. While his father hosted concerts, the future sultan studied the Quran. memorized lines from Hafiz, and wondered why no one else seemed worried that the empire was bleeding provinces faster than it could name them. And when Abdul Majid died, things did not improve. Next came Abdul Aziz, the uncle with expensive tastes and terrible judgment. You remember him for two things: his obsession with European-style naval fleets, and the fact that he left the empire almost completely broke. He blew the treasury on warships that never left harbor, and on gifts to foreign dignitaries who never sent thank-you notes. And then came Murad V, Abdul Hamid's brother. Oh, Murad, the liberal hope, the golden boy of the young Ottomans. Everyone thought Murad would save the empire with his progressive ideas and shiny French phrases. And for 3 months, he did. Well, he tried. But Murad had a problem. He was mentally unstable. Whether it was inherited or triggered by the pressures of the throne, historians still argue. Some say he was an alcoholic. Others say he suffered from severe depression, possibly even schizophrenia. Either way, his reign ended almost before it began. He was deposed, quietly and with a lot of awkward shuffling. And that's where you come in. You, Abdul Hamid, the quiet brother, the one with the notebooks and the suspicions and the tendency to look like you're already planning someone's arrest. You're dragged forward. Not literally, of course. You walk with dignity. But inwardly, you know what this is. You're being crowned because everyone else has failed. Not because they believe in you, but because they've run out of options. And you? You accept. You nod. You say the right words. But you also start drawing lines. The first line is between you and your ministers. You don't trust them. How can you? Half of them were backing Murad until 5 minutes ago. The second line is between you and the West. They talk about reform, but you know what they mean. They want the empire to be weak, divided, manageable. They want railways they can own and ports they can tax. They want debt repayments more than diplomacy. And the third line, the most private one, is between you and your own heart. Because deep down, you know this won't end well. You're stepping onto a throne that's less of a seat and more of a seesaw, and everything depends on how long you can keep it from tipping. You hold your first audience. The room is filled with hopeful eyes and guarded optimism. The young Ottomans want a constitution. The military wants pay. The people want stability. And you? You give them all just enough to buy time. You convene the first Ottoman parliament in 1876. It's a big move, a symbolic one. There's talk of liberty in the air, and European newspapers briefly stop mocking you. But then comes the Russo-Turkish War. You don't even get a honeymoon period. Suddenly, the empire is bleeding territory again, this time in the Balkans. Bulgarian uprisings, Russian invasions, horrific massacres on both sides. It's chaos. And you, the brand new Sultan, are expected to make sense of it. You try. You send envoys. You reorganize the army. You issue royal decrees. But it's like trying to bandage a shipwreck. And when you realize that the parliament is more talk than action, more ideology than loyalty, you shut it down. Just like that. Gone. Back to autocracy. Some call it betrayal. You call it survival. The next 2 decades will be your own strange reign, a tightrope walk between collapse and consolidation. And right now, here at the beginning, you start learning how to walk it. You read even more. You study European politics like a man studying enemy anatomy. You memorize battle maps. You correspond secretly with tribal leaders in Arabia, and you begin building something few people notice at first: your personal myth. You don't want to be just a sultan. You want to be the caliph, the global spiritual leader of all Muslims. That title had existed for centuries, sure, but it had rarely mattered. You're about to make it matter, because you know the empire can't survive as a nation-state. It's too big, too diverse, too full of rebels and debt collectors. But maybe, just maybe, It can survive as an idea people believe in. You start small. You issue edicts calling for religious unity. You fund Islamic schools abroad. You commission scholars to write texts emphasizing Ottoman spiritual legitimacy. You're not just managing a dying empire. You're trying to resurrect its soul. And as this chapter closes, you sit again in your library. Another book open. Another map unrolled. The sun has set, but the lamps are still burning. You're still reading, still watching. And somewhere inside, you believe the weight of history might be lighter if you just learn enough. You, the boy who read too much, are now the man who never stops reading. It begins like something out of a whispered cautionary tale, the kind told by aging bureaucrats who still clutch prayer beads when they speak of the throne. You're standing in the back of a marble hall that echoes with polite footsteps, watching Abdul Hamid tighten the imperial belt around a body that seems to already know the weight it's about to carry. This isn't a coronation. It's a calculation. He's not ascending to glory. He's being thrown to the wolves. The Ottoman Empire at this moment is less a state than a balancing act between debt, uprising, and international manipulation. Everyone smiles for the ceremony, but you can tell they're smiling too hard, like a family congratulating the cousin who just inherited a haunted mansion. You remember what happened to Murad V, that poor, twitchy brother, who wore the crown for exactly 93 days before being declared mentally unfit. The official story said, nervous exhaustion. The real story said, he cracked under the pressure of trying to be progressive while the empire burned at the edges. Abdul Hamid watched it all unfold. Now he takes the throne not with dreams, but with a sigh. He knows exactly what he's walking into. Your first months as Sultan are a tangle of impossible decisions. The empire is losing control of the Balkans. Serbia and Montenegro are growling like wolves outside the door, backed by Russian whispers and British indifference. The treasury is so empty, it echoes. Every pasha wants something different, and half of them don't even hide their European bribes anymore. And what's worse, you're expected to be a reformer. Everyone wants you to be the guy who saves the Ottoman Empire from itself. Even you, secretly, hope you can. So, you announce the Constitution of 1876, a shiny, carefully worded document that declares new rights, limits royal authority, and creates a parliament. Newspapers abroad call it the Turkish Enlightenment. You call it a bluff. You give them what they want. A photo op of a modern sultan, smiling in front of progress. But you keep the real power in your coat pocket. You know this empire doesn't need more speeches. It needs to stop bleeding. And bleeding, it turns out, is exactly what it keeps doing. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 erupts like a fever. You didn't start it, but you inherit it like a poisoned chalice. Russia claims it's coming to defend Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, but everyone knows it's about empire. Russia wants Constantinople, always has, always will. And so you do what every Ottoman Sultan before you has done. Try to hold the line with an underfunded army, a fractured chain of command, and hope. Hope that the West might blink first, but no one blinks. The war is a disaster. Ottoman forces lose battles in Bulgaria, in Armenia, across the Danube. Russian troops come terrifyingly close to the imperial capital. Panic floods the streets of Constantinople. You send prayers. You send desperate letters to Britain and France. And finally, after weeks of scrambling diplomacy, the Treaty of San Stefano is signed. It's humiliating. You're forced to give up huge swaths of territory, especially in the Balkans. A massive new Bulgarian state is created, practically a Russian satellite, and the empire's Balkan grip weakens like paper in rain. But wait, it gets worse. The British and Austrians are horrified by how much Russia has gained. They smell a power shift and immediately force another treaty, the Congress of Berlin in 1878. You're not even properly invited, despite the fact that your empire is the one being carved up like lamb at a feast. Britain gets Cyprus. Austria gets Bosnia. Everyone gets something. Except you. You get a bruised map and a growing reputation for being the guy on the throne when the empire shrank. The parliament you created to please the reformers? Gone. You dissolve it within 2 years of its birth. Just shut the doors one day and never reopened them. Why? Because they didn't help during the war. They debated. They stalled. They offered opinions while Russian cannons thundered closer. So you made a decision. Never again would you risk parliamentary bickering when the empire's survival was on the line. From here on out, you'd rule alone. With silence, with secrets, and with a pencil sharpened on both ends. And here's where it gets interesting. Because most leaders, after such a colossal failure, would collapse under the weight of it. But Abdul Hamid doesn't. He adapts. He hardens. You watch as he starts reshaping the empire into something different, not glorious, but durable. He trims the bureaucracy. He pours funds into education. Yes, education. But the kind that teaches loyalty, not liberalism. He starts building railroads, telegraph lines, and military academies. He cuts waste and centralizes control. And behind every improvement, there's a shadow. A whisper network of spies, informants, and loyalists. He creates a government within the government, where real power is exercised in backroom meetings and handwritten orders. Newspapers are censored, books are banned, even theater productions are watched carefully. At one point, he bans a play because it contains the name Hamid, and that character dies. Too symbolic, he says. Too risky. You shake your head, but part of you gets it. He's not trying to be loved. He's trying to last. The empire may be losing territory, but internally, it's becoming a tightly wound machine. One man at the center, 1,000 eyes in the walls. And yet, despite all this tightening, he's not a monster. Not exactly. You see flashes of the old Abdul Hamid now and then. The bookworm, the poet, the man who still writes letters to exiled scholars asking about obscure grammar rules. He builds hospitals, funds public fountains, sponsors artists, as long as they don't get clever. He even allows Jews and Christians to maintain their religious courts and schools, knowing that tolerance is cheaper than persecution. But trust? He never gives that out. Not anymore. Not after Murad. Not after the war. Not after Europe proved that treaties are just stories written in disappearing ink. So you walk with him through the halls of Yildiz Palace again. The rooms feel heavier, the light dimmer. He's older now. He moves slower. But his mind, still sharp, still suspicious, always calculating, always scanning, and always aware that somewhere out there the wolves are still circling. They're just quieter now. You're back inside the palace, but this time the air feels different. Thicker, like someone's trying to smother the daylight before it reaches the corners of the room. You trail behind Abdul Hamid as he moves like someone who's just heard a rumor and isn't sure whether to dismiss it or dismantle half the government because of it. The walls are cleaner than you remember, the rugs tighter, the smell of polished wood stronger, but it all feels curated, controlled. Welcome to the new style of rule. You're in the middle of a reign not built on charisma or conquest, but on surveillance, silence, and calculated paranoia. Abdul Hamid doesn't rule like his ancestors, on horseback or in war tents. He rules from behind drawn curtains and through the quiet scratch of his pen. Every appointment is considered. Every piece of mail is filtered. Every newspaper headline is scanned, censored, or rewritten entirely. The Sultan has learned that in this century, ideas are more dangerous than armies. And so he begins constructing what might be one of the most intricately watchful governments in modern history. You see it firsthand. As he sits at his desk, he has reports laid out like crime scene evidence. Who said what in a tavern in Aleppo? Which local preacher suddenly changed the tone of his Friday sermon in Skopje? What rumors are floating through the Midres in Medina? He reads these accounts daily, thousands of them, sometimes for hours on end. Not because he's nosy, because he's terrified. Terrified that somewhere out there is the next revolt, the next foreign puppet, the next knife in the back. His reaction isn't madness. It's method. If you were watching the empire disintegrate slowly from every border, you might want to control the center as tightly as he does. He starts requiring loyalty oaths from officials, implements new layers of civil bureaucracy, sometimes overlapping, so that departments spy on each other unknowingly. It becomes hard to tell if you work for the government or are being observed by it, or more likely both. Even his own ministers aren't exempt. You watch him receive them one by one in the reception room, not all together, never all at once. Divide and rule isn't just a strategy. It's a daily practice. They enter alone, bow low, speak in cautious sentences. Every word is a calculation. Every glance is measured. Because Abdul Hamid has this look, this way of holding his eyes slightly narrowed, as if already writing your fate in a ledger you'll never see, you don't know if he trusts you until it's too late, and even then, maybe not. Yet for all the layers of suspicion, the machinery works. For a while. The empire stabilizes, not grows, but stops hemorrhaging. The chaos slows down. Infrastructure projects begin to hum quietly in the background. You see telegraph lines going up across Anatolia, government schools being built in towns that barely had mosques before. There's a plan under all this paranoia, and it's working. Sort of. You stand in one of these new schools one afternoon, a place where boys recite both Quranic verses and Ottoman grammar rules in chalk-smeared rooms. The instructors teach loyalty to the Sultan, the concept of centralized authority, the majesty of Islamic unity. It's an education system designed not to produce free thinkers, but disciplined subjects. The curriculum is strict, the teachers paid just enough to obey, and every student is subtly being molded into a citizen of Abdul Hamid's ideal empire. One religion, one sultan, one state. But outside the schools, not everyone's buying it. There are stirrings, little tremors of discontent. In cafes, on trains, even in mosques. People begin to whisper that maybe the Sultan is holding on too tight. That maybe an empire built on silence can't sing anymore. You hear these murmurs in strange places. A poet in Damascus writes a line about a caged bird, and the next day, he's gone. A teacher in Salonika asks his students to read a European novel, and by week's end, he's reassigned to a village with no books. Every deviation is monitored, not punished loudly, but erased quietly. This is Abdul Hamid's genius. He doesn't create martyrs. He creates absences. Yet even he can't stop the age from changing. The printing press, that terrible miracle, has escaped his grasp. Underground publications begin to circulate, pamphlets critiquing his rule, satirical cartoons printed in Paris but smuggled into Istanbul in sacks of rice. The opposition isn't loud, but it's clever and growing. But let's not skip ahead. Here, inside the palace, things still function. He's built something resembling order. He's not asleep at the wheel. He's gripping it with white knuckles. His daily routines are part of the empire now. You watch him walk the garden paths every morning after. Prayer, alone except for the guards pretending not to guard. He stops to inspect rose bushes, talks to gardeners about soil quality. But even then, he's thinking about provincial governors and train schedules and whether a letter from Jerusalem means what it says or what it implies. It's exhausting, not just for him, for everyone. His paranoia bleeds into policy. His distrust becomes law. And slowly, without announcing it, the Ottoman Empire transforms into something new, a place where fear wears a fez and loyalty is a form of currency. Historians still argue whether this era was a slow suffocation or a necessary brace, a cast for a fractured empire that couldn't afford any more breaks. Some say Abdul Hamid's methods prevented complete collapse. Others say he merely delayed the inevitable. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Because while he's building this fortress of control, he's also quietly laying down the tracks for the empire's final journey. You're with him one night in his study when he reviews the plans for a railway from Damascus to Mecca. It's ambitious, expensive, and slightly insane. But he sees it not just as transportation, it's strategy. A way to unite Muslims across continents. A way to move troops faster. A way to connect the empire's spiritual heart to its logistical backbone. And he does it. He starts building. Even the Germans are impressed. Maybe even nervous. That's the thing about Abdul Hamid. For all his suspicion, all his tightening of screws, he's not just reacting. He's still dreaming. But his dreams come wrapped in silence. And the silence, like everything else in his empire, grows louder with time. You step outside the palace walls for a moment, onto the crooked, dust-layered roads that connect distant corners of the empire. And what you see is not just geography, it's prognosis. They call it the sick man of Europe, and you're standing right inside the patient's body, trying to figure out which organs still work and which are just pretending to. The Ottoman Empire in Abdul Hamid's era is no longer that unstoppable medieval juggernaut you once read about in textbooks. It's now a stitched-up inheritance, wheezing along from Anatolia to Arabia, from the Balkans to Basra, barely holding itself together with baling wire, borrowed gold, and bureaucratic glue. And you, poor Sultan Abdul Hamid, are trying to convince the world, and maybe even yourself, that it can still dance. You walk the back halls of the Sublime Porte, and you hear it. Those quiet conversations behind closed doors where European ambassadors sip cardamom coffee, while gently suggesting that the Ottomans, perhaps, might want to consider giving up this port or that railway line for the sake of progress. It's always for the sake of progress, never for the sake of empire. Britain, France, Russia, and later Germany, they all treat the Ottoman Empire like a chessboard, except none of them respect the king still sitting on the throne. The empire isn't just diplomatically weak, it's financially anemic. By the 1880s, the Ottoman government is drowning in debt, thanks in part to the extravagance of previous sultans, and in part to European banks that smell vulnerability like sharks smell blood. You watch as Abdul Hamid is forced to accept the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, basically a foreign-run committee set up to siphon tax revenues directly into European coffers. It's the financial version of being slapped across the face in your own throne room. This debt administration operates independently, collects revenue from vital industries like salt and tobacco, and answers to no Ottoman official. You can almost feel Abdul Hamid flinch every time a report arrives. But here's the twist. He endures it. He doesn't throw a tantrum or start flinging viziers out of windows. Instead, he internalizes it, adjusts, recalculates. It's humiliating, yes, but it also gives him time. And time is something he knows how to weaponize. Back inside Yildiz Palace, the atmosphere shifts again. You're with the Sultan as he pores over maps in his library. Some of them are old and fading, others brand new with gleaming German ink. He traces borders with a finger and murmurs something about equilibrium, because that's the secret behind his strategy. Not dominance, not expansion, but equilibrium. He wants to balance one foreign power against another so carefully that none of them can afford to fully attack or fully embrace the empire. One day, he charms the Germans, invites Kaiser Wilhelm for tea and exaggerated compliments. The next, he reminds the British of their interest in a stable Middle East. Then he flirts cautiously with the French, just enough to make the Russians nervous. It's a diplomatic tightrope, and Abdul Hamid walks it with the focus of a man carrying porcelain across a minefield. You accompany him to a meeting with his advisors. Some are excited about a new proposal. Maybe the empire could sell off more railway concessions to fund modernization projects. Others are nervous, because every contract signed seems to come with an extra clause that quietly transfers sovereignty. Abdul Hamid listens, nods, then retreats back into his chambers to think. He doesn't rush decisions. He broods over them like a chess master stuck in endgame, every move a possible death. But here's something you weren't expecting. Amidst all this pressure, he still finds ways to care about detail. He insists on reading foreign newspapers, sometimes in translation, sometimes in French. He personally reviews photographs sent from distant provinces. He critiques the landscaping of government buildings. It's not micromanagement, it's vigilance. Historians still argue whether this obsessive involvement kept the empire functioning or merely delayed its inevitable implosion. Either way, it's exhausting to watch. You try to keep up, but the sheer volume of information, tax rates in Thessaloniki, militia movements in Yemen, telegrams from Sudanese tribal chiefs, is overwhelming. Abdul Hamid doesn't flinch. He absorbs, then acts. And while all this is happening, the term sick man hangs in the air like an unwanted nickname at a family reunion. It first came from Tsar Nicholas III of Russia, a man who, during a private conversation with the British, called the Ottoman Empire a sick man, a very sick man. The phrase caught on. You hear it echoed in drawing rooms from London to Vienna, repeated in journals and diplomatic memos like a foregone conclusion. But you notice something else too. For a sick man, the Ottoman Empire under Abdul Hamid is strangely unyielding. Yes, it's shrinking. Yes, it's hemorrhaging wealth. But it refuses to die. It lingers like a stubborn cough in Europe's throat, disrupting every plan and alliance. This is Abdul Hamid's true achievement. Not resurrection, but resistance. He can't reverse the empire's decay, but he can slow it, redirect it, even turn it into a tool. If the West sees the Ottomans as a corpse, then maybe it won't notice when the corpse moves. You step into one of his rare public audiences now, an elaborate affair, full of ritual and careful symbolism. Foreign diplomats kneel or bow, depending on their rank and cultural flexibility. Abdul Hamid sits on the throne in full regalia, every piece of embroidery designed to scream power, even if most of the real power is slipping quietly into European hands. He speaks softly, never blusters, but he always ends with a phrase that sounds more like a warning than a blessing. Something about unity, faith, the eternal nature of the caliphate. Because in his mind, the political Ottoman Empire might be cracking, but the spiritual Ottoman world is just beginning to solidify. And so, while European politicians call him the sick man, Abdul Hamid begins rebranding himself, not as a failing emperor, but as the rightful caliph of all Muslims. It's not just PR, it's survival strategy, and it will change everything. You're back inside Yildiz Palace again, except this time you're being led down a hallway most people don't even know exists. No gold trim here, no diplomatic pleasantries, just stone beneath your feet and oil lamps flickering faintly overhead. A eunuch nods silently and gestures toward a heavy wooden door. Beyond it lies a room lined with filing cabinets, a desk buried in reports, and several pale-faced men scribbling notes at a feverish pace. This is not some forgotten corner of imperial storage. This is the beating heart of Sultan Abdul Hamid II's empire of secrets. Welcome to the surveillance state. This is where Abdul Hamid processes his real intelligence, not the flowery official reports that come through ministers, but the raw, nervous observations of 1,000 paid informants spread across every cafe, market, mosque, and village square in the empire. It's like the entire population has been deputized to keep an eye on itself. And you? You're in the middle of it now, sorting through letters intercepted mid-transit, telegrams copied before they reached their recipient, and journals confiscated from dusty bookstores. This isn't ruling by decree, it's ruling by whisper. Abdul Hamid didn't invent political paranoia in the empire, but he perfected it like a chef finally getting the spices right. He believes, perhaps rightly, that the Ottoman state won't fall from a grand battle, but from a well-timed whisper in the wrong ear. And so, he listens. To everything. You sit beside him as he reads a private note from a sheikh in Tripoli, wondering if the slightly altered phrasing is a coded warning or just poor grammar. He frowns. He underlines. He assigns someone to look into it. Later, he'll personally review the outcome. The man is exhausted, you can tell, but wide awake in that caffeine insomniac kind of way. Wired not from stimulants, but from constantly expecting betrayal. The surveillance system reaches into the smallest corners. In Damascus, a schoolteacher is reported for praising French literature with too much enthusiasm. In Izmir, a grocer is quietly arrested after selling an imported newspaper with a cartoon mocking the Sultan. In Thessaloniki, a group of university students is monitored so closely that their graduation speeches are pre-approved before delivery. Abdul Hamid's intelligence service, known to many as the Journal Service due to the daily reports it produced, is like a paranoid diary written by an entire empire. And in a strange way, it works. While nationalist movements bubble in the Balkans and European spies pass like shadows through Ottoman cities, Abdul Hamid remains one step ahead of most, though never all, of them. Of course, this vigilance comes at a cost. Trust becomes a relic. Ministers fear one another. Governors become more concerned with pleasing the palace than governing effectively. Citizens begin to whisper behind closed shutters instead of speaking in public. Creativity shrinks, but so do open rebellions, for now. Historians still argue whether Abdul Hamid's surveillance machine prolonged the life of the empire or merely suffocated it more slowly. Some say he was brilliant, turning information into insulation, staying ahead of coups and uprisings through the power of ink and suspicion. Others say he created a feedback loop of fear, where the government became more responsive to rumor than to reality. Whatever the verdict, one thing is clear. You can feel the tension everywhere. Even the walls seem to listen. The postman, the bath attendants, the doormen, they all have stories of being quietly approached, handed a few lira, and asked a few too many questions. A harmless inquiry here, a friendly chat there, and suddenly a file with your name on it lives in Yıldız. What's truly wild is that the Sultan isn't hiding any of this. He doesn't trumpet it either, but the palace makes no real effort to conceal the scale of its informant network. He wants you to know you're being watched, because that, in itself, is power. At one point, he even begins reviewing not just domestic threats, but international ones. Reports start coming in from Ottoman agents abroad, students in Paris, merchants in Alexandria, scholars in London. Even in far-off Muslim communities in India, Abdul Hamid's name is spoken with a kind of mystical reverence. The Caliph is watching, they say. And you realize, suddenly, that for all his paranoia, Abdul Hamid has achieved something remarkable. He's created a spiritual presence that extends beyond his political reach. Through his surveillance, he hasn't just protected the empire. He's broadcast the message that Islam has a vigilant guardian. It's this reputation, oddly enough, that wins him the admiration of Muslims outside the empire far more than the citizens under his. Control. And here lies the contradiction. Inside, the empire is tense, suffocated, even brittle. But outside, especially in British-ruled India, Dutch-ruled Indonesia, and French North Africa, Muslims begin to see Abdul Hamid not as a repressive sultan, but as a protective caliph. He funds madrasas in Cairo, sends Qurans to Malaya, and keeps up correspondence with scholars in Delhi. And the surveillance? It doesn't stop at borders. Even those distant connections are monitored and catalogued. You leaf through some of those letters now. Beautiful calligraphy, words of faith, gratitude, or subtle political suggestion. The palace reads them all. Every page, every sentence. Every time someone invokes the caliphate, Abdul Hamid wants to know why, and what it might mean next. But this obsession with control isn't without irony, because the more you try to control ideas, the more they slip through the cracks. Smuggled books, coded phrases, Poems disguised as praise but thick with metaphor. They all still make it through. You sit with a young Ottoman intellectual one evening, sipping tea in a dim apartment while he reads aloud from an article published in Geneva under a pseudonym. It critiques the Sultan's rule, subtly, cleverly, with metaphors so layered you'd miss them if you blinked. He smiles at the brilliance of it, then he hides the paper beneath a floorboard. "Just in case," he says. Because everyone knows. The palace sees everything. And yet, despite all the fear, all the silence, the empire doesn't collapse. It holds. Abdul Hamid holds it, not because he fixes it, but because he prevents it from fully falling apart. He buys time. Precious, borrowed, miserable time. Time bought with trust, drained from every level of society, but time nonetheless. You return to Yildiz late that night, where the Sultan is again at his desk, the same lamp burning, the same creased forehead, the same tired but awake eyes. He reads another file, another town, another rumor. He sighs and moves on to the next. You're standing now on a long stretch of rail, dust gathering at your boots and the sun pressing hot against the back of your neck. But this isn't just a railway, it's a political artery, an imperial artery, and Abdul Hamid II's gamble against the tide of collapse. Before you even step onto the tracks, you already know the story whispered behind this project. They call it the Hejaz Railway, and it is many things all at once. A train line, a dream, a strategy, and perhaps the last serious attempt by a sultan to stitch his empire together before it completely unravels into dust. You see, by the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire isn't just shrinking, it's splintering. Like a once solid plate that's begun to crack from the center outwards. Provinces in the Arab world are restless. The Balkans have become an open wound. And in places like Syria, Iraq, and the Hejaz, the Ottoman flag flaps in the wind more out of habit than loyalty. Local leaders take their cues from Istanbul on paper, but in practice they answer to clan, tribe, or foreign influence. So, what do you do if you're Abdul Hamid? You can't send troops to every village. You can't bribe every emir. But maybe you can do something else, something grand, something visible. You build a railway from Damascus to Medina, a line that will unite distant provinces under one track, reduce the time of the pilgrimage from 40 days to 5, and move soldiers, supplies, and sermons faster than any mule or camel ever could. But this isn't Europe, where steel and coal are plentiful and engineers work with the backing of industrial empires. This is the Ottoman desert, where sand swallows shovels and each mile costs more than it earns. And yet, Abdul Hamid insists. Not only that, it's his idea. He champions it personally. He won't allow European companies to fund or control it either. No foreign loans, no backdoor deals. He wants the Hejaz Railway to be paid for by Muslims, run by Muslims, and operated for Muslims. This isn't just infrastructure, it's ideology. The call goes out across the Islamic world. Donations pour in from Indian merchants, Egyptian nobles, and North African scholars. Friday sermons across the empire encourage believers to give what they can for the caliph's great railway. And they do. Pennies from peasants, pounds from princes. The line begins slowly, painfully slowly, stretching south from Damascus, inching toward Amman, then Ma'an, then finally the red cliffs of Medina. It never reaches Mecca, despite the original vision. But it reaches far enough to matter. You step onto one of the early trains now. It's hot, cramped, but magical. For the first time in centuries, a villager from northern Syria can board a machine built with Ottoman parts and ride it through lands his grandfather only knew by camel caravan. Every station is an outpost of empire, flying the same flag, posting the same laws, broadcasting the same royal decrees. You realize in this moment what Abdul Hamid is really building. Not just a railway, but a line of belonging, a visible, touchable reminder that yes, This is still the Ottoman world. Yes, you still live under the caliph's protection, and yes, you are still part of something greater than your own town. The Hejaz Railway is perhaps Abdul Hamid's most enduring legacy, and ironically, it's also a symbol of his greatest fear, that without connection, the empire would dissolve into forgotten provinces and drifting loyalties. He doesn't just want trains running. He wants hearts realigned, minds recentered. It's why you see inscriptions along the track not just with measurements and numbers, but with Quranic verses. It's why the project is framed not just as an engineering feat, but as a sacred duty. The railway is not secular progress. It's spiritual geography. But as the tracks stretch farther, so does the challenge. Bedouin tribes whose trade routes are disrupted begin to grow restless. Some sabotage the lines. Others demand payment for protection. Still others simply don't trust the sudden arrival of Ottoman soldiers on iron machines in the middle of their desert. There are reports of raids, of bridges destroyed, of stations torched by night. Abdul Hamid is furious, of course, but he's also practical. He begins offering scholarships to Bedouin boys to attend Ottoman military academies. Starts including tribal leaders in advisory councils. The strategy is simple: include them, or eventually lose them. And so, the railway becomes a tool not just of transport, but of soft power. Historians still argue whether this was a masterstroke of unity or a desperate bid to keep a fracturing empire from snapping entirely. Some say the Hejaz Railway could have transformed the empire's southern half into a connected, administratively functional region, if only it had time. Others say it merely delayed the inevitable, serving as a showpiece more than a solution. But for now, you ride the tracks, and you watch the empire fly past in windows, the minarets of Damascus, the markets of Amman, the empty vastness of Wadi Rum. Every stop is a question. Will this place still be Ottoman 10 years from now? 5? Tomorrow? The railway can't answer that, but it tries. Back in Istanbul, Abdul Hamid reads updates on the construction progress like a man awaiting word from a distant limb. He is deeply invested, personally, emotionally, politically. It's not just about steel. It's about survival, and maybe redemption. Because the empire may be surrounded by wolves, but if he can just connect the flock, just long enough, just tightly enough, maybe the howls won't matter. You stand with him one afternoon as he views a freshly printed map of the completed sections. He doesn't smile often, but here, you see it. A trace of pride, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of hope. Not for victory, but for postponement. He knows the end is out there, but he wants the ending to arrive on his terms, with a timetable, a schedule, a train that still runs. You're walking through the narrow halls of Yildiz Palace once again, but this time there's a different scent in the air, something colder, metallic, not quite smoke and not quite sweat, but somewhere between the two. The Sultan's staff are moving with stiffer urgency. The guards are a little more restless at their posts, and even the birds in the garden seem to chirp with less enthusiasm. You follow the sound of hushed voices toward one of the inner chambers, where Abdul Hamid is seated, not with maps this time, but with newspapers. Foreign ones: French, German, Arabic, English. And they all say the same thing in slightly different fonts. The young Turks are stirring. You've seen their shadows before, at first just rumors, then whispers, and now full paragraphs of defiance. The Young Turk movement, a slippery confederation of exiled intellectuals, disgruntled army officers, reformist students, and political idealists, is no longer content to just mutter their frustrations over Turkish tea in Geneva or Paris cafes. They're printing papers, organizing cells, smuggling pamphlets into the empire wrapped in shipments of olives and soap. And Abdul Hamid knows it. He's been reading their manifestos, reluctantly admiring their clarity, their energy, even as he marks them for arrest or exile. You can see it in his face. something between annoyance and recognition. These men, these rebellious intellectuals, they are the very type of Ottoman citizen he once wanted to cultivate. Sharp, globally literate, committed to reform. The only problem is, they've turned that intelligence against him. And worse still, they're right. Not entirely, of course, but enough to sting. They accuse him of stifling progress, of ruling through fear, of choking the empire with suspicion and turning it into a fossilized shell. They say the Constitution must be restored, Parliament reopened, rights recognized. They talk of freedom and reason and nationalism, and he knows in his heart that if he were just a few decades younger, he might have agreed with them. But age and power change a man. They calcify hope into suspicion. And so the Sultan doubles down. He tightens censorship. He expands the spy network. He hunts these young Turks from Istanbul to Paris to Cairo, sometimes arresting their cousins when he can't reach them directly. He uses diplomacy where he can, violence where he must. But the cracks are widening, even within the military, his precious military. Sympathies are shifting. You sit in on a private briefing with the palace guard, and one of the commanders leans in too close to whisper, "There are whispers in the Third Army. Salonika's garrisons are uncertain." That one word, uncertain, lands like a cannonball in the room, because everyone knows what it means. That the discipline that once held the empire's last institution together is starting to give way. Salonika, the cosmopolitan port in modern-day Greece, is a melting pot of ethnic tension, economic anxiety, and frustrated modernity. It's also where many of the young Turks are based, and where the cracks in the Sultan's authority are now becoming fissures. Historians still argue whether Abdul Hamid could have stopped the movement early on by co-opting it instead of crushing it. Some say he missed the moment to bring moderate reformers into the fold and ended up radicalizing them through repression. Others argue that the empire was already too fragmented, that no amount of negotiation could have bridged the gap between absolute rule and constitutional dreams. Whatever the truth, you see now that the palace is on high alert. Abdul Hamid walks slower, speaks more carefully, but his eyes are sharper than ever. He knows the clock is ticking. And the young Turks? They know it too. They're not some ragtag student group anymore. They've become a movement, calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP for short. They adopt the language of modernity, reform, science, nationalism, and constitutionalism. They evoke the memory of 1876, the year Abdul Hamid briefly allowed a constitution before shutting it down. They demand its return. And in 1908, they finally act. It begins with army officers in Macedonia, men trained in Ottoman academies, loyal to the empire, but not to the Sultan. They mutiny, demand reform, threaten to march on Istanbul if the constitution isn't restored. For once, Abdul Hamid hesitates. He knows the empire is fragile, that any civil war might be the final straw. And so, after 3 decades of solitary rule, he makes a decision that shocks even his closest advisors. He yields, reinstates the constitution, reopens parliament, declares a new era of liberty. Crowds flood the streets of Istanbul. Celebratory gunfire lights up the sky. Intellectuals weep. Poets publish tributes. For one brief moment, it feels like the Ottoman Empire might be reborn. And yet, it's not. You watch Abdul Hamid during this strange interlude. He's polite, composed, but distant. You can almost hear the gears in his head turning. Because this is not his victory. It's a humiliation disguised as a concession. He's no longer the absolute ruler. He's a constitutional monarch now, and not even the starring one. The young Turks hold the reins. Parliament is loud again. And worse still, it's chaotic. Debates spiral. Factions splinter. Some deputies want Turkish nationalism. Others want pan-Islamism. Armenians demand recognition. Arabs ask for autonomy. Kurds, Greeks, Jews, all with their own flags tucked under their tongues. The unity that Abdul Hamid once enforced through silence is now unraveling in the name of freedom. The empire is louder, but not stronger. And in this noise, you can feel Abdul Hamid watching, not speaking, just watching, waiting. And then, a twist. In 1909, just months after the Grand Restoration, a mutiny breaks out in Istanbul itself. Reactionary troops demand the end of secular reforms, the rollback of new laws. They march through the city. Riots erupt. For a moment, it looks like the Sultan might reclaim power under the guise of restoring order. But the young Turks act fast. Troops from Salonika march in, crush the revolt, and do the unthinkable. They depose Abdul Hamid, strip him of his title, and exile him to Thessaloniki, ironically, the very city where the revolution against him had begun. You're there in the final hours as he's informed of the decision. He doesn't rage, doesn't scream, just sighs. Maybe because he knew it was coming. Maybe because in some strange way he's relieved. His reign, one of the longest in Ottoman history, is over. And the man who once ruled by ink and silence is now a private citizen, escorted out the back door of history by men who used to call him Padisha. You step off the train in Thessaloniki, and it hits you. The silence. Not the watchful silence of Yildiz Palace, where every wall had ears and every shadow carried a note to the Sultan's desk. This is the silence of aftermath, of displacement, of a man who has outlived his crown and now wakes each morning without a title, without a council, and without a realm to whisper back at him. Abdul Hamid II, once the shadow behind every flickering lamp in the empire, is now merely Abdul Hamid Effendi, residing in a modest villa in the very city that incubated the movement which brought him down. And you, awkward witness to this strange political afterlife, walk beside him as he navigates what it means to be the former center of gravity in a galaxy that has since reorganized itself. There's no royal procession, no ringing of bells. He is guarded, yes, watched, yes, but by men who used to fear him and now only log his meals and mail. His exile is not prison in the classic sense, but a kind of curated insignificance. The garden is quiet. The house smells of lemon soap and damp stone. And every object, every cushion, every teacup whispers, "You used to rule the world." He receives no official visits, no councils, no ministers, no ceremonial robes. Instead, he reads. A lot. History, mostly, and newspapers. Always newspapers. He still wants to know what happens to the empire now that he's no longer at the helm. But the headlines don't favor nostalgia. The Young Turks, or the Committee of Union and Progress, now dominate the government. And while they've inherited power, they're also discovering that governance is far messier than rebellion. Parliament is fractured. Ethnic tensions are flaring. And the press, once censored and cautious, now swings wildly between euphoria and panic. From his quiet perch, Abdul Hamid watches it all unfold like a retired chess master wincing at the clumsy openings of new players. Sometimes he scoffs. Sometimes he mutters, "They will learn." He writes letters, but few are sent. He has his books, his memories, and occasionally, a visitor or two, family members mostly, or former palace servants who now live humbler lives in Thessaloniki. They speak carefully. Everyone does. Because though the Sultan no longer has a throne, he still has the air of someone who could, at any moment, be summoned back to it. The exile begins to stretch into routine. Morning coffee, walks in the garden, reading at dusk. The world outside spins faster. Revolution in Persia. The Italo-Turkish War in Libya. The Balkans rumble with the first hints of full-scale collapse. The empire is shedding territory faster than ever before. You sit beside Abdul Hamid as he reads yet another report of a province slipping away. He doesn't react violently. He simply folds the paper and says, almost to himself, "They will see what happens when you let go of the reins." It's not bitterness, it's conviction. Because here's the strange, almost Shakespearean truth. Abdul Hamid believed deeply that he was the last true safeguard against the West. Not because he was perfect, or democratic, or even beloved, but because he understood the machinery of decline. He saw the vultures circling, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and believed that only his control, however rigid or ruthless, kept the empire from dismemberment. Historians still argue over whether that's true. Some say his paranoia accelerated decay. Others argue he bought the empire 30 extra years it otherwise wouldn't have had. But you, standing here in Thessaloniki, can't help but feel that the fall is speeding up without him. And then, it gets worse. In 1912, just 3 years into his exile, Thessaloniki is captured by Greek forces during the First Balkan War. Yes. The city that hosted the revolution that dethroned him is now no longer even part of the empire. For a brief and surreal moment, Abdul Hamid, the former Sultan of the Ottomans, the Caliph of Islam, is technically a prisoner of war in a foreign country. The irony is so thick you could bottle it. The Ottoman authorities panic, and arrangements are made to transfer him, quietly, urgently, back to Istanbul. No ceremony, no press, just a man, his books, and his exile relocated. He returns to the city he once ruled, but not to Yıldız Palace. That door has been sealed. Instead, he's housed in Beylerbeyi Palace, a beautiful but faded estate on the Asian side of the Bosporus. You go with him. The walls are high, the corridors echo more. There's a view of the water, yes, but also of the ships that no longer answer to his orders. His quarters are better than Thessaloniki. The food improves. He has more staff, more space. But the burden remains. He is not a man restored. He is a living relic. Tourists sometimes float past on boats, pointing toward the palace where the last real sultan lives. He doesn't wave. He barely even looks. His beard has grown whiter. His fingers shake slightly now as he reads. But the fire behind his eyes, the one that scanned reports and anticipated threats, is still there. Diminished, but not gone. You sit beside him during long evenings where he talks to himself more than to you. He recounts decisions, plays old conversations in his head, quotes letters from memory. One night, he speaks of the time he sent a rare book to the Mahdi's son in Sudan as a gesture of peace. Another night, he recites a poem, something Persian, melancholy. You ask him if he regrets anything. He doesn't answer, not directly, just stares at the Bosporus and says, "They never understood what I was trying to protect." The end comes quietly. On February 10th, 1918, after nearly a decade of exile, Abdul Hamid II dies in Beylerbeyi Palace. The empire, now ruled by men who once stood in his shadow, is exhausted. World War I is raging. Istanbul is tense, chaotic. When the news breaks, there are no riots, no wild mourning, just a solemn recognition that something enormous, something foundational, has finally ended. His funeral is attended by the royal family and officials who, for all their modernity, still recognize the weight of his legacy. You walk with them as the coffin is carried through the streets. People line the path, unsure whether to weep, bow, or simply watch. Some whisper prayers, others whisper criticisms. And that, in the end, is Abdul Hamid's legacy. Complicated, contested, too conservative for the liberals, too reformist for the fundamentalists, too authoritarian for the romantics, too shrewd for the fools. A ruler who controlled everything, yet could not control the future. A man who tried to be the last line of defense against the West, and in doing so, became both the fortress and the cage. You're back in Istanbul, but not the Istanbul of empire and pageantry. Not the Istanbul of parades and palace balconies and men in tasseled fezzes nodding solemnly in government halls. No, this is a city of shadows now, littered with the exhaustion of war, of loss, and of the impossible task of pretending that everything still functions the way it used to. It's 1918, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II is dead, gone quietly, gone without fanfare. And yet, in death, he looms as a figure whose legacy refuses to settle. You stand near his tomb, plain, almost too plain for a man who once ruled over millions, listening to the murmured prayers of those who still remember him as Ulu Hakan, the great Khan. Others, though, pass by without even a glance. For them, he was a relic, an obstacle, a warning. And perhaps, in some inconvenient way, he was all three. The Ottoman Empire at the time of his death is barely an empire anymore. World War I has carved deep lines across its territories. The Young Turks, who once promised a golden age of constitutional renewal, have plunged the empire into an alliance with Germany, hoping to outmaneuver the British and the Russians and reclaim lost prestige. You walk the war-battered streets now, past wounded soldiers, foreign diplomats, and empty bakeries. The city feels like a patient breathing through machines, sustained not by hope, but by inertia. And through all of this, you can still sense Abdul Hamid's fingerprints in places, his old rail lines still occasionally running, his buildings, his libraries, his schools, and his memory, now the subject of tavern arguments and midnight political whispers. Some blame him for the empire's decline. He made us weak with fear, they say, sipping bitter tea and shaking their heads. He turned the empire into a spy ring. Others defend him passionately. He knew what the West wanted, they counter. He kept them out, he warned us, and we didn't listen. Historians still argue whether Abdul Hamid II's reign was a necessary evil, a missed opportunity, or the final grip of medieval absolutism clinging to a world that had already turned modern. But what they don't argue is this: he mattered. And now, in the years after his death, his absence becomes a strange kind of presence, like a quiet judge whose verdict you still wait for, long after he's left the room. The Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, once so full of promise, are now increasingly authoritarian themselves. Their initial dreams of a multi-ethnic Ottoman unity have collapsed under the pressures of war, nationalism, and realpolitik. You walk past the government offices and feel the unease of power that no longer carries conviction. Decisions are made, yes, orders given. But behind every one is a question. What would Abdul Hamid have done? Not out of reverence, but out of uncertainty. Because, say what you will, he was a planner, a survivor, a weaver of a web so intricate that even his enemies sometimes longed for the stability he enforced. That longing begins to grow, strangely, after his death. Ottoman loyalists begin to resurrect his image, not as a tyrant, but as a protector. Islamic newspapers publish respectful retrospectives. Religious scholars speak of the caliph who upheld the faith in dark times. Even some of his fiercest former critics begin to hedge their condemnations. He was harsh, they admit, but perhaps necessary. And in the vacuum left by his departure, new problems multiply. The empire's final years are a sequence of unravelings, military defeats, diplomatic humiliations, and the slow, painful carving up of land by the victorious Allied powers. The Treaty of Sèvres is signed in 1920, dissecting the empire like a patient on a surgeon's table. Anatolia to be shared, the Arab lands now mandates, the caliphate reduced to a ceremonial echo. You sit with an old bureaucrat, retired from service, who once handed files to Abdul Hamid himself. He holds his tea with trembling fingers and says, "When the great Khan ruled, I feared the night, but at least the sun rose in the morning." You don't respond. There's nothing to say. Because nostalgia, especially in ruins, is both a refuge and a trap. Beylerbeyi Palace, where Abdul Hamid died, is slowly becoming a museum now. Tourists wander through the marble halls, guided by soft-spoken curators who mention his name with a hint of distant drama. You trail behind one such group, catching fragments of their questions. Was he really that cruel? Did he invent the secret police? Was he mad? The guide shrugs, smiles, says, "He was complicated." And you think, that's probably the most accurate sentence spoken all day, because Abdul Hamid II cannot be reduced to one verdict. Not comfortably. He was deeply conservative yet built modern. Railways. He was paranoid yet visionary. He stifled dissent with cruelty, yet protected the empire's independence longer than anyone thought possible. And now, in this twilight between empires, his ghost walks the halls. Not literally, though some palace staff claim otherwise, but in the choices being made, the regrets being whispered, and the slow realization that for all his faults, Abdul Hamid saw the future more clearly than many of his enemies. He saw what imperial collapse would look like. He saw what Western encroachment really meant. And he tried, desperately, obsessively, sometimes brutally, to stop it. It didn't work. But the attempt echoes. Even in the 1920s, as Mustafa Kemal rises in Anatolia and the Republic begins to take form, you find that Abdul Hamid's name is still spoken, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with rage, but never indifference. The final Ottoman Sultan Caliph has left a mark so deep it curves through history like a hidden river. You sit beside an elderly imam in a dusty neighborhood mosque, where the lights flicker and the wooden beams creak in the wind. He leans toward you and says, "The Caliph was not loved, but he was needed, and now we are adrift." You don't argue. Because in this moment, looking back over 4 decades of Abdul Hamid's reign, his exile, and the unraveling that followed, you understand the strange, frustrating truth. That sometimes, the figures we resent most bitterly are the ones who held the storm back a little longer than we realized. You wake to the distant sound of a muezzin's call bouncing over rooftops that no longer fly the Ottoman flag, and for a moment, you forget where you are. Istanbul still breathes with history, but now it does so in a different language, one of revolution, republics, and restoration dreams. Abdul Hamid II has been gone for a few years now, but you quickly realize that his story didn't end with his burial. In fact, in many ways, it only intensified. You walk the same roads he once rode through in imperial carriages, but the people now move faster. The buildings are different too, some old ones gone, new ones standing in their place, straight lines and concrete where once there were arches and tiled courtyards. The Ottoman Empire is no more. But Abdul Hamid's shadow remains, trailing behind every decision made by the new rulers and clinging like incense smoke to every debate about what kind of future the Turks deserve, or even who counts as a Turk anymore. It's the early years of the Republic now. Mustafa Kemal, who would soon become known simply as Ataturk, is reshaping the very soul of the nation, and his vision could not be more different from Abdul Hamid's. Where the old Sultan looked east for legitimacy, toward Islam, tradition, and unity through faith, Ataturk looks westward, embracing secularism, nationalism, and the sharp blades of modernity. The contrast is so stark that it feels surgical. You can feel the tension ripple through every policy change. The call to prayer is sung in Turkish, not Arabic. The fez, that iconic Ottoman headgear, is banned. The Islamic courts are dismantled, and perhaps most painfully to those who still whisper prayers in Abdul Hamid's name, the caliphate is abolished entirely in 1924. just 6 years after Abdul Hamid's death. A legacy that had survived for over 1,000 years, gone with the stroke of a pen. And you wonder, was it inevitable? Did all of this lie curled in the heart of Abdul Hamid's reign, just waiting for the moment he let go? Historians still argue over that. Some say he delayed the republic by trying too hard to preserve the past. Others say his rule made the reaction more violent, the secular turn more radical. But whatever the truth, Abdul Hamid becomes something more complex in death than he ever was in life. For his supporters, he becomes a sainted figure, a misunderstood guardian, a bulwark who saw the empire's enemies more clearly than anyone else. They call him Ulu Hakan, the great ruler, and begin to invoke his name in poetry, religious lectures, even in some early political resistance to Ataturk's reforms. For others, especially in the Kemalist elite, he remains a cautionary tale. The tyrant who strangled progress. The autocrat who refused reason. A ghost they must exorcise by banning his symbols, dismantling his institutions, and rewriting the history that praised him. But you see something stranger begin to form. As time passes, both versions soften at the edges. The invincible tyrant becomes a complex administrator. The flawless protector becomes a flawed human. In schools, textbooks begin to refer to him not just as a paranoid sultan, but also as a builder of railways, of universities, of a certain resilience that outlasted his own rule. And beyond Turkey, in the wider Muslim world, Abdul Hamid's name begins to carry a different weight altogether. In British-ruled India, in the emerging voices of pan-Islamism, in Cairo and Damascus, and even in the homes of Muslim intellectuals in Paris, his memory lingers like a symbol of what might have been, a united Muslim world under one caliph, resisting colonial encroachment, asserting dignity in a century that seemed designed to humiliate them. You read through pamphlets from that era, bold, almost romantic in tone. Abdul Hamid, they declare, was the last sovereign who stood between Islam and the West. These voices don't talk about his censorship or his paranoia. They speak of his stand against European rail companies, his refusal to sell land to Zionist settlers, his correspondence with distant Muslim scholars. They see him not as a failure, but as a martyr of modern geopolitics. It's ironic, really. The same man who was reviled in his own empire by many for being too authoritarian is later revered by Muslims across the world as a defiant figure of independence. You attend a quiet academic conference in Egypt years later, and one speaker stands up and simply says, "We wouldn't have needed a Muslim brotherhood if we still had an Abdul Hamid." And the room nods, not because they agree entirely, but because the sentiment feels like a wound they all recognize. Back in Turkey, though, things get more complicated. The Republic marches on. The Ottoman past is not just buried, it's paved over. The very language changes. Ottoman Turkish, with its Arabic and Persian influences, is replaced with Latin letters. Generations grow up unable to read their grandparents' books, including Abdul Hamid's own diaries. You visit a library in the 1950s and find his journals, dusty and untouched. The script looks beautiful but unreadable now to most of the nation he once ruled. And yet, the memory won't die. In the 1960s, 70s, and especially the 80s, as Turkey grapples with coups, economic crises, and an identity pulled between Islam and secularism, Abdul Hamid's name returns, quietly at first, then more loudly. Politicians begin quoting him again. Religious groups invoke him as proof that Islam and statehood once walked hand in hand. Nationalists start to reinterpret his pan-Islamism as early Turkish geopolitics. You watch posters of Abdul Hamid pop up in bookstores, his face on documentaries, his rule now framed as misunderstood genius rather than paranoid despot. It's no longer taboo to admire him. And in that shift, you begin to understand the strange journey of legacy. Abdul Hamid II, once dethroned and ridiculed, is now being rehabilitated by a nation that no longer quite knows how to balance its modern face with its Ottoman soul. It's a tug of war between the past and the future, and he has become the rope. And what about the people, the everyday Turks, Arabs, Bosnians, Kurds, and others who lived through his reign? Their memories, if you search for them, are layered. Grandparents recall the silence in cafes when the secret police might be listening. Others recall free education, government scholarships, the pride of a caliph who spoke to Muslims in Burma and Morocco alike. Some remember fear, others dignity, but always with weight. Because Abdul Hamid, love him or loathe him, was never forgettable. You sit now in a modern Istanbul cafe, watching a documentary rerun on a mounted TV, and the narrator closes with this. He tried to hold the empire together, not with freedom, but with loyalty, not with applause, but with threads of obligation. And for a while, he succeeded. You sip your coffee, and you think, maybe that's what made him both tragic and necessary. Not because he won, but because he slowed the defeat. He complicated it. He gave it shape. And even now, over a century later, you can still feel the shape of his reign under the asphalt and Wi-Fi and skyscrapers. He is gone. But you're still walking through the empire he tried to save. You find yourself now in a part of Istanbul where history leaks out of the pavement, where every crooked alley and crumbling wall has heard the name Abdul Hamid, whispered with a dozen different meanings. Some utter it like a prayer, others like a warning. But for you, it's something else, a puzzle, a riddle passed down from empire to republic, never quite solved, never quite finished. And to understand it, you begin to trace the Sultan's echoes through the generations, watching as each one reinterprets him, reshapes him, and, sometimes, tries to resurrect him. The 20th century moves fast, leaving the empire's bones behind, but not its spirit. And in that spirit, Abdul Hamid begins to reappear, not in the form of politics at first, but in art, literature, even nostalgia. Ottoman-themed novels, dripping with velvet descriptions of court life, begin to surface in the 1950s and 60s. Films portray grand palaces and tormented sultans. Some are sympathetic, casting Abdul Hamid as a tragic figure misunderstood by history. Others turn him into a villain, pacing through dark corridors with candlelight and paranoia. The audiences don't always know what to believe, but they keep watching. Because something about that lost world, that suspended empire between East and West, faith and modernity, still tugs at the imagination. It's during this time that more of Abdul Hamid's private papers come to light. His letters, his journals, the detailed reports he demanded daily. You read some, slowly, under the yellow glow of a state archive reading lamp. The handwriting is meticulous. The tone, precise. And here's what surprises you most. Not the cruelty, not the suspicion, but the loneliness. The constant burden of watching over an empire that barely believed in itself anymore. He writes about distant governors who ignore orders, about Western journalists spreading rumors, about the terrible weight of trying to rule a house where the walls have already begun to creak. And every now and then, he slips into something gentler. A line about the roses blooming at Yildiz. A note about a child seen playing in the garden. It's jarring. Human. Not the Sultan of Doom that some imagine, but a man trying desperately to preserve what's left of a world he believes still has value. By the late 20th century, something stranger begins to happen. Political figures, some conservative, others nationalist, start referencing Abdul Hamid again, but now not just as a ghost of empire. They begin using his image as a symbol of strength, sovereignty, and resistance to foreign meddling. You see his face on posters at rallies, quotes from his speeches, real or paraphrased, circulating on pamphlets. One line appears over and over again. The empire was not lost in battle, but in betrayal. It's never sourced, and historians aren't even sure he said it. But it doesn't matter. People believe it. It feels true. Because in Abdul Hamid, they find the story of a leader who tried to hold the line while everyone else was looking the other way. And in a century that saw coups, oil politics, Cold War interference, and rising Islamophobia, that image resonates, even among people who never lived under his rule. His legacy becomes a kind of political inkblot. People see what they need to see. The devout see the last true caliph. The nationalists see the sultan who stood up to Europe. The centrists see a cautionary tale about what happens when you silence reform too long. And the scholars? They see a goldmine of complexity. Because Abdul Hamid is one of those rare figures who cannot be flattened into good or bad. He ruled like a spider, carefully spinning webs of alliances and intelligence. He modernized hospitals, schools, and the press, even while censoring those same papers. He feared foreign debt, but encouraged foreign technology. He dismissed parliament but obsessed over public opinion. Historians still argue whether he was driven more by faith or fear. But what they do agree on is that he was profoundly committed to the empire, to its survival, and to a version of it that placed Islam, Ottoman identity, and imperial sovereignty above all else. And now, decades later, as Turkey re-examines its roots, you see his name slip back into the curriculum, the speeches, the headlines. In the early 2000s, a television series dramatizing his reign becomes a hit. Viewers are hooked. Every episode blends palace intrigue, Western conspiracies, loyal pashas, and impassioned speeches. It's fiction, of course, but the kind of fiction that shapes memory. You sit in a living room with a family watching the series, and as the Sultan gives a stirring monologue about resisting European encroachment, the grandfather nods with quiet approval. "He was a wall," he mutters. "They broke it." And yet, even among his admirers, there's disagreement. Some lament that he didn't do more to democratize. Others claim he should have crushed the young Turks earlier. Still others blame the empire's collapse on the rot he allowed to fester through inaction. Everyone agrees on one thing, though. He saw what was coming. And he tried to stop it. In modern Turkey, as new debates emerge about secularism versus religion, East versus West, and sovereignty versus globalization, Abdul Hamid's story becomes a mirror, showing each side what they fear or hope for. He becomes, strangely, a figure of both caution and inspiration. You hear a young activist quote him at a rally, arguing against foreign intervention. You see a mural with his face, alongside Ottoman calligraphy, on the side of a building in Konya. You read an op-ed titled, "What Would Abdul Hamid Do?" in a mainstream newspaper. He has, somehow, become timely again. And perhaps that's the final irony. The man who was dethroned as obsolete, an old relic of autocracy, has returned as a symbol of relevance in a new age of uncertainty. His railways may have rusted, his palace turned to a museum, and his empire long gone, but the questions he grappled with remain chillingly alive. How do you balance faith and modernity? How do you resist domination without becoming a tyrant? How do you preserve identity in a world that seems to want you erased? You look out over the Bosporus again. The ships are sleeker now, the skyline taller, but the questions don't change. And as long as they remain unanswered, Abdul Hamid II will never truly leave. His portrait may not hang in Parliament, but it lingers in the national memory, quiet, complex, defiant. Not quite a hero, not quite a villain, just a man who tried, desperately, to hold back a century of storms with nothing but willpower and suspicion. And now, as the wind picks up over the water and the call to prayer rises once more, you feel the weight of his era settle back into place, heavy, unresolved, and unforgettable. You're sitting in the corner of an old bookshop in Fatih now, tucked behind a stack of fading Ottoman memoirs, and as you flip through the yellowing pages of a diplomat's diary from the Abdul Hamid era, you begin to see something that no textbook ever quite captured. how his rule felt. Not from the top looking down, but from the street, from the tea house, from the embassy waiting room where young consuls sweated nervously through surveillance. The diary entries are short, often just fragments. Another arrest this morning, one notes. The Russian ambassador looks smug. Another simply reads, "He knows everything, even what hasn't happened yet." You pause at that line, because it sums up the eerie omnipresence that came to define Abdul Hamid II's reign. You walk back out into the sunlight and feel it again. That strange sensation of being watched by history itself, of moving through a city that once pulsed with paranoia. But this isn't fear anymore. It's fascination. Istanbul is learning to live with its ghosts, and Abdul Hamid's is perhaps the most stubborn of them all. In mosques, his name is whispered as part of prayers for the lost caliphate. In universities, his strategies are dissected in political science seminars, and in the neighborhoods where time seems slower, elderly men still refer to him as Efendimiz, our master. But as always, his legacy resists clarity. So today, let's walk together through one more corridor of that legacy, how he ruled with information. You re-enter the Sultan's mind not through his proclamations, but through his greatest obsession, intelligence. Spying wasn't a tool for Abdul Hamid. It was a worldview, a system, an art. His journal, a daily digest of events, reports, gossip, and regional movements compiled by hundreds of informants across the empire, was his lifeline. Some of it came from professional agents, but much of it came from civilians, porters, scribes, imams, even rival pashas trying to curry favor. Everyone knew that everyone else might be watching. The Sultan's palace at Yildiz functioned as both fortress and information factory, where clerks parsed whispers into files and files into patterns. You walk through one of the restored archival rooms and see the old filing cabinets, wooden, tall, imposing. Thousands of dossiers on poets, merchants, professors, army officers, foreign visitors, and even school children. Nothing was too trivial. You think about that. A school child reciting a poem slightly too liberal could be flagged for further monitoring. Of course, that level of surveillance came at a price. Trust evaporated. Ministers filtered their conversations. Intellectuals self-censored. Even family dinners became calculated affairs. But from the Sultan's point of view, this was survival. He didn't just see enemies in Europe, though there were plenty. He saw them at home, among reformists, nationalists, minorities seeking autonomy, and the ambitious elites of his own court. And it's hard to blame him entirely. You read about the dozens of assassination plots uncovered during his reign, the bombs, the forged documents, the arms smuggled through mosques. One 1905 attempt, executed by Armenian revolutionaries, nearly succeeded. A horse-drawn carriage packed with explosives detonated just moments after the Sultan's ceremonial exit from Friday prayers. The delay? A conversation with a sheikh, fate, or divine intervention, depending on whom you ask. Historians still argue whether this atmosphere of constant threat justified Abdul Hamid's oppressive tendencies. Some say he used fear as an excuse. Others argue it was fear that ruled him, not the other way around. You lean toward the latter as you continue to piece through the archives, because what becomes clear is this: he was a man besieged, not only externally, but internally, trapped between the empire's competing futures, each one pulling in a different direction. The Arab provinces wanted more religious leadership, the Balkan ones, more secular nationalism. The minorities wanted rights, the military wanted better funding. The European powers wanted territory. And Abdul Hamid? He wanted to keep the mosaic glued together, even if he had to do it with invisible thread. That's the tragedy you begin to understand. His resistance to change wasn't always a rejection of modernity. It was a rejection of disintegration. He modernized infrastructure with railways, introduced telegraphs, promoted science, and even funded public health reforms. But he did it all in a framework where the state still had to control every syllable. Because if the state lost control of speech, it might lose everything. And sometimes, he was right. You read the reports from his intelligence network showing how foreign journalists were feeding anti-Ottoman stories to newspapers in London and Paris, how arms shipments were disguised as medical aid, how ideological training camps were sprouting in Egypt and Tunisia. It wasn't all paranoia. Much of it was true. But truth, in Abdul Hamid's world, only deepened the shadows. And still, within all that darkness, he built. That's the paradox. Abdul Hamid was arguably the most prolific builder of the Ottoman sultans, not in conquest, but in structures. Schools, hundreds of them. Libraries, hospitals, bridges. He believed deeply in education, but only the kind that wouldn't destabilize the state. Religious schools flourished under his rule, but so did technical institutes. He tried to breed a generation of loyal, capable civil servants who could outthink the foreign agents he so feared. You visit one of those schools now, a crumbling stone structure turned into a modest university annex. The walls are cracked, but you can still see the original inscriptions, the star and crescent above the entrance. Inside, students chat over laptops, unaware that they walk daily through a sultan's dream. That duality, modern tools in ancient halls, is everywhere. A train line laid under Abdul Hamid still carries commuters. A lighthouse he commissioned still guides ships. A law he drafted about property rights still echoes in modern Turkish legal codes. You stand near the edge of the Bosporus one afternoon and look toward Europe. The sun is dipping low, the water glittering with that impossible golden shimmer. You try to imagine the Sultan here, watching the same sun. Not with wonder, but with calculation. Who would land next? Who would bribe the customs officer? Who would fund the next uprising? And beneath those questions, a deeper one he never voiced aloud. Could the empire be saved without turning into something it no longer recognized? That's the unspoken dilemma of Abdul Hamid's legacy. He didn't just fear the end of the empire. He feared what would come after. An empire that had lost its soul in the pursuit of its survival. And in trying to prevent that, he became the very figure some would blame for speeding its fall. Yet even today, the files he kept are studied for their accuracy. The rail maps he funded are still used. His personal library, once closed to all but a few, is now open to the public. People walk through its quiet rooms with reverence, curiosity, sometimes awe. You step inside and touch the spines of books he personally requested on mathematics, theology, botany, and war. So many subjects, so many questions, as if he was trying to read his way out of disaster. And perhaps, in his way, he was. Because Abdul Hamid II didn't rule like a warrior. He ruled like a librarian afraid of fire, shelving each page in order, marking every threat, hoping the shelves wouldn't burn before he found the answer. You step out of the library, Abdul Hamid's own library, and into the shifting breeze of Istanbul, where gulls scream above the Bosporus and ferries cut trails across the water. And suddenly, it strikes you how absurd it is that this man, who held the Ottoman Empire in his grip for over 3 decades, was so often dismissed by history as little more than a footnote between sultans and secularists. And yet, here you are, still chasing his ghost through corridors he built, down tracks he laid, through the bureaucracy he micromanaged into a machine of exactitude and suspicion. If Section 13 gave you the Sultan as Spider, master of information webs, then this section shows you the consequences of living inside that web too long. Because you're not just following his ideas anymore, you're starting to feel what it meant to exist inside the world he created, where paranoia was currency, and every moment of peace came with a price. You ride one of the trains built under his reign, part of the legendary Hejaz Railway, and the conductor leans over and whispers proudly, Sultan Abdul Hamid's dream. The tracks stretch south, deep into the Arabian heartlands, once connecting Damascus to Medina, an imperial vein pulsing through deserts, mountains, and villages. At first glance, it seems like pure piety, a rail line for pilgrims. But of course, nothing Abdul Hamid did was ever just one thing. Yes, it was for the Hajj, easier, safer, faster. But it was also a geopolitical masterstroke, a way to move troops quickly, a method of reinforcing sovereignty over distant provinces, and a silent message to the British and French snooping around in Egypt and the Levant. We're still here. You look out the window as the city gives way to dry plains, and you think about the ingenuity and weight of it all. This wasn't a man blind to modernity. He was fluent in it, but he wanted it on his terms, in his language, under his flag. And that meant something different than how Europe defined it. As the train hums beneath you, you think about how Abdul Hamid ruled at a time when technology was exploding. Telegraphs, newspapers, railways, early electricity. But for him, these were not liberations. They were instruments, tools to consolidate, to monitor, to shape public perception. You pass a small village where the Sultan once funded a school, and you can still see the foundation stone with his tughra, that imperial calligraphic signature, curling across the marble like a sleeping dragon. The villagers speak warmly of him. He brought the school, he brought the well, the road. And in places like this, you understand why people still revere him. Because in the imperial core, he may have been feared, even hated. But out here, in the periphery, he was the only ruler who remembered them. But as with all things Abdul Hamid touched, there's another side to the story. You pull out a worn journal from your bag, notes from an Armenian shopkeeper in Van, smuggled out decades ago. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak. The entries are cautious, polite, but you can feel the unease building. The soldiers asked questions again today. Why we were reading Armenian books, why we didn't use the Ottoman tongue. Another day. A neighbor disappeared last night. His wife says he was taken for asking about land titles. And eventually, the inevitable. There are whispers of violence. We stay indoors. No one trusts anyone anymore. You sit with that for a long time, because it's easy to get swept up in Abdul Hamid's vision of unity, Islamic solidarity, pan-Ottoman loyalty, resistance to foreign invasion. But for the empire's minorities, especially the Armenians, that vision often meant exclusion, suspicion, and, ultimately, devastation. Historians still argue whether Abdul Hamid directly ordered the massacres of Armenians in the 1890s, which left tens of thousands dead. Some say he unleashed them. Others say he allowed them. Still others argue he lost control of local authorities once the violence began. But the name Hamidian massacres remains. And in memory, especially among diaspora communities, it's unforgivable. You walk through one of the neighborhoods that once held a vibrant Armenian population. The churches are quiet. Some have been repurposed. The signs are in Turkish now. A few elders nod as you pass, their eyes holding both welcome and wariness. And it's here you confront the deep fracture in Abdul Hamid's legacy. Because he saw the empire as a body, a single organism that needed unity to survive. But in his desperation to hold it together, he began to treat difference as disease, dissent as infection, ethnicity as a potential rebellion. And so, he tightened the grip. He pushed Islamic identity harder. He sidelined the multilingual, multi-ethnic fabric that had once been the empire's strength. And in doing so, he may have accelerated the very fragmentation he feared. You flip open a recent article by a historian who puts it bluntly, Abdul Hamid II was the last sultan who might have saved the Ottoman Empire through reform. Instead, he chose control. And it's hard to argue. But then again, another article, same stack, same journal, presents a different view. Control was the only tool left. The empire was not dying. It was being devoured. And again, you can't deny the truth in that either. British interference in Egypt, Russian advances in the Caucasus, French manipulations in Syria, foreign banks choking the Ottoman economy. Abdul Hamid faced enemies on all fronts, external and internal, and he did what many leaders do under siege. He circled the wagons. But wagons don't hold forever, and his vision, impressive, multifaceted, paranoid, and bold, would die with him. You board a ferry now, crossing back to the European side of Istanbul, watching as the skyline rises in the distance. Mosques, minarets, construction cranes. And as the wind brushes your face, you feel the lingering questions hover again. Could he have loosened the reins earlier? Could a true constitutional monarchy have emerged under his rule if he hadn't dissolved Parliament in 1878? Could the diverse populations of the empire have been integrated instead of managed like threats? Could the empire have survived? Or was he simply holding back a tide no one could stop? The answers aren't clear. Maybe they never will be. But as the ferry cuts across the Bosporus, and you catch a glimpse of Yildiz Palace on the hills, still sitting in quiet defiance, you realize something. Abdul Hamid didn't just leave behind structures, laws, or scandals. He left behind a question mark. A living, breathing question about what leadership means in an age of crisis. About whether survival justifies everything, and whether silence, safety, and sovereignty are worth the price of liberty, identity, and trust. These aren't just Ottoman questions. They're eternal ones. And maybe that's why you're still here, still tracing his footprints, still standing in his shadow more than a century later. Because some legacies don't fade, they sharpen. You stand now at the gates of Yildiz Palace, and for a moment, time folds in on itself. The trees still whisper the same secrets they did when Abdul Hamid walked here each morning, alone, flanked by silence, watched always by shadows that might be friend or foe. There are tourists now, school groups, foreign academics pointing out the tiles and tracing old fountain inscriptions. But you know better. You know this wasn't just a palace. It was a mind, his mind, petrified into architecture. High walls, narrow corridors, hidden doors, surveillance from every angle. The heart of Abdul Hamid's empire wasn't the throne room. It was the corridors between decisions, the places where he watched, listened, and decided, mostly alone. This section of your journey pulls you even deeper into that solitude, because while his advisors came and went, and ministers quarreled and vanished into the fog of bureaucracy, Abdul Hamid remained in place for 33 long years. And that kind of reign is less like holding power and more like becoming a fixture of it. His inner circle, tight, loyal, often selected more for obedience than brilliance, served at his pleasure, but rarely challenged him. You imagine yourself as one of them now, pacing the outer rooms, waiting for an audience, knowing that even before you enter, he already knows what you're going to say. He's read the reports. He's read your report. He's read the report about your cousin who spoke too loudly at a cafe last Thursday, and he's still deciding whether to reward or remove you, because power, for Abdul Hamid, was not something displayed. It was something accumulated, slowly, silently, sometimes bitterly. His reputation for micromanagement wasn't exaggerated. He personally reviewed the content of school textbooks. He edited government press releases. He oversaw palace gardens and knew which gardener had left a hose running last week. His control extended from imperial railways down to the seating arrangement at religious conferences. You begin to understand the pressure of it, not just on his ministers but on himself, because every inch of slack risked unraveling everything. The empire was already fraying when he took the throne in 1876. The Balkans were in open revolt. The Russians were circling like hawks. Debt was swallowing the treasury. And Europe had the audacity to pretend concern while licking its lips over Ottoman provinces. So when Abdul Hamid suspended the newly drafted constitution just 2 years into his reign, he wasn't thinking about ideology. He was thinking about buying time. You sit under one of the plane trees in the palace garden now, and you realize this wasn't tyranny for pleasure. It was governance by siege mentality. If he could slow the bleeding long enough, maybe the empire could stabilize. Maybe. But slowing isn't the same as healing. And Yildiz Palace, despite its high walls and velvet curtains, became less of a court and more of a bunker. He moved the court there deliberately, abandoning Dolmabahce, the old showy palace on the Bosporus, for this wooded fortress on the hill. Here, he could watch the city without being seen. Here, the palace guards were loyal. Here, his control was absolute. And here, the Sultan slowly turned inward. The press was muzzled. The parliament dissolved. The universities discouraged from anything too radical. Radical, meaning different. There were still reforms. Hospitals opened, railways extended, telegraphs buzzed across the empire. But the people implementing them did so under the constant weight of suspicion. You walk now through the old administrative building and find a file labeled simply Para. Just that, Para, the European quarter of Istanbul. Inside are pages and pages of handwritten notes, detailing which diplomats were seen meeting which journalists, which foreign bookshops stocked French liberal tracts, who had imported illegal printing presses. This wasn't intelligence in the modern sense. This was obsession. And it reflected a deep truth about Abdul Hamid's worldview. Freedom was a luxury, and survival was not. He had no time for Rousseau. He had time only for maps. Maps of railroad expansion, maps of Russian troop positions, maps of tribal unrest in Syria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania. And while Europe accused him of medieval despotism, they kept coming to him anyway, negotiating loans, lobbying for concessions, angling for influence. You laugh quietly at the irony. The same powers that preached democracy to the Ottomans were negotiating under the table to get control of their oil, their ports, their rail lines, and Abdul Hamid knew it. That's why he distrusted them so completely. One letter, hidden in the back of the Yildiz archive, reveals this mindset perfectly. It's addressed to a close confidant. The Sultan writes, "They offer friendship in French, but sharpen knives in English." You remember that line for days, because in those 11 words, he summarized his entire foreign policy. He didn't hate the West. He studied them, adopted their technologies, even sent scholars abroad, but he trusted none of them. And so he maneuvered constantly, balancing British influence against German protection, French ambitions against Russian threats. He played each power like a piece on a chessboard where no one followed the rules, and for a while, he did it brilliantly. The empire didn't lose significant new territory under his rule, not until the Italians took Libya in 1911, which happened after he was already dethroned. He managed to delay a full-scale collapse decades longer than most had expected. But all that maneuvering came at a cost. Internally, the empire suffocated. Young intellectuals fled. The middle class began to whisper. Military officers muttered about the need for reform. And eventually, the dam broke. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution, led by a coalition of reformist military officers and exiled intellectuals, forced Abdul Hamid to restore the constitution and reopen parliament. For a brief moment, it seemed like the empire might reconcile its past and future. But the trust was gone. The Sultan, always wary, was now openly cynical. And the Young Turks, initially claiming loyalty to him, were already planning his exit. Within a year, after a failed counter-coup, Abdul Hamid was deposed and sent into exile. He was replaced not by revolutionaries, but by his brother, Mehmed V, a frail, quiet man who became a symbolic ruler while real power shifted to the triumvirate of Enver, Talayat, and Cemal. You look at photographs of Abdul Hamid in exile, older, heavier, beard white as snowfall, reading books in his garden at Beylerbeyi Palace. no longer watching the world through reports, just waiting. There's a strange grace in those final years. No grand declarations, no rebellion. Just a man who once held an empire choosing silence at the end. But even in silence, he watched. His servants would later recount how he kept a detailed diary, still read the newspapers, still tracked world events, still suspected plots, right up until his death in 1918. The world, by then, had already begun to collapse. The Great War was in full swing. The Ottomans were bleeding again. And Abdul Hamid, who had tried so hard to delay this very moment, died knowing it had come anyway. You return to Yıldız one final time before leaving Istanbul. The palace is quieter now, the trees taller. A crow watches you from a branch as you place your hand on the stone wall, cool and rough. This was the center of an empire once, and the center of a man's empire of the mind, tireless, brilliant, fearful, flawed. Abdul Hamid II was no saint, but neither was he the monster his enemies made him out to be. He was a sultan of contradictions. And like all contradictions, he demands not judgment, but understanding. You've now stepped beyond the walls of Yıldız for good, but the shadow of Abdul Hamid still walks beside you. Quiet, deliberate, maybe even heavier now than it ever was during his reign. The man who once ran an empire with a pen sharper than any sword is gone, but his absence has only made the questions grow louder. And as you walk through the neighborhoods of Istanbul, you begin to see just how deeply his story shaped what came next, not just politically, but psychologically. The Ottoman Empire after Abdul Hamid didn't collapse all at once. It cracked, and each crack told a story of what had been deferred too long. Because when the Young Turks took power in 1909, they inherited not just an empire, but a culture of suspicion, a bureaucracy addicted to secrecy, and a population conditioned to obey without question. And even as they promised liberty, equality, and modernization, they too found themselves slipping into the old habits, monitoring dissidents, censoring speech, consolidating authority. The names changed, but the fear remained. You stand now outside the old Parliament building, watching tourists snap selfies with statues of Ataturk nearby, and you can't help but feel the strange irony. Abdul Hamid had tried so hard to stop the tide of modernity from washing away the Ottoman world, and yet his fall only accelerated it. The empire would limp through the Balkan Wars, barely survive World War I, and collapse entirely by 1922. And in its place rose the Turkish Republic, a new nation with new flags, new alphabets, new ideologies. But even then, echoes of Abdul Hamid's reign didn't vanish. In fact, they were baked into the very DNA of the Republic. You walk through the archives of early Republican Turkey, and you see it. The obsession with control, the desire for centralization, the fear of fragmentation. Different ideals, yes, but the same tactics. And here's the twist. Modern Turkey, for all its radical departures, still inherited Abdul Hamid's fear of foreign manipulation, his passion for infrastructure, his reverence for the past, and his suspicion of free press when it gets too loud. Historians still argue whether the Republic was truly a clean break, or just a new chapter written in the same anxious hand. And as you pass a cafe where students debate Ottoman history over bitter tea, you realize that Abdul Hamid isn't just a historical figure here. He's a prism. Everyone sees something different in him. For some, he's the last legitimate caliph, a defender of Islam and tradition, standing valiantly against the West's cultural and political encroachment. For others, he's the architect of decline, the man whose paranoia stifled reform and alienated the very people who could have saved the empire from ruin. And for the scholars, the careful ones, he's something more complicated still. A man who was trying to bridge a world that no longer wanted to be bridged. You take a bus down to Thessaloniki. Yes, still within the memory of Abdul Hamid's empire. and walk the streets where the Young Turk movement had once brewed in coffee houses and secret meetings. This was the place where his future was plotted behind his back. This was where the empire's younger minds had given up on waiting for permission and decided to take history into their own hands. You find a building, now a nondescript bank, that once held one of those meetings. The marble lintels are chipped, the door replaced, but inside, a woman working at the front desk knows the history. "Yes," she says. "They planned the revolution upstairs, but it was Abdul Hamid who built the road they took to get there." You nod, because it's true. The educational reforms he pushed had created this generation of reformers. His investments in infrastructure had helped them travel, organize, publish, plan. He wanted loyal subjects. He got revolutionaries. The tools of empire he designed became the tools of its undoing. You remember something you read once, an old saying from the late Ottoman military academies: "Do not teach your dog to read if you're afraid it will write your obituary." Harsh, but not wrong. Abdul Hamid's empire had tried to modernize without democratizing, to reform without releasing control. And like all tightrope acts stretched over too long a distance, it eventually lost its balance. Yet even after the empire was dead and buried, his name refused to rest. During the early decades of the Republic, official narratives painted him as a tyrant. Schoolbooks vilified his censorship. Speeches ridiculed his fear of parliament. And yet, under the surface, the state quietly preserved his methods. Secret police, controlled education, monuments to unity above diversity. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Turkey began to seriously reevaluate Abdul Hamid's legacy. Not just in political speeches, but in public discourse. Television dramas romanticized his court. Books explored his diplomacy with nuance. Families with old Ottoman roots began to speak his name with pride again. And today, as you visit an Ottoman revival bookstore in Üsküdar, you find his face on a dozen new covers, some stern, some wistful, all claiming to tell the real story. You flip one open. Inside, it begins, "The Sultan who saw the future, but could not stop it." You close it and look out the window toward the sea. The future did come. It came like a train, iron wheels, steam, velocity, and no brakes. Abdul Hamid tried to reroute it, delay it, slow it just enough for the empire to brace itself, and he almost did. But the speed of change was too great, and the foundations too cracked. Still, you wonder, was it failure, or was it defiance in the face of inevitability? You ask a historian at a nearby university, and she shrugs. "He was a necessary contradiction," she says. "A conservative who loved innovation, a monarch who feared power, a ruler who dreamed of unity but deepened the divides." And maybe that's all you can ever say, that he was necessary, that without him, the Ottoman Empire might have collapsed sooner, that without him, there would have been no time to prepare for what came next. You walk back into the streets as the sun lowers again. Istanbul glows, amber and ash. Minarets pierce the sky like pens writing the last sentences of a story nobody wants to finish. And yet, you keep reading. Because you're starting to understand that this isn't a story with an ending. It's a loop. Empires fall, nations rise. But the questions remain. Can you modernize without losing yourself? Can you protect your people without fearing them? Can you be both ruler and servant to the idea of a state? Abdul Hamid didn't have the answers, but he lived the questions. And now, as you carry them through the city he once ruled, past his libraries, his railroads, his echoing corridors, you realize that maybe that's enough. Not to answer, just to ask, just to remember, just to keep walking. You wake up the next morning with the call to prayer seeping through your hotel window, soft and hollow like it's being recited from the other side of time. The city stretches before you, rooftops layered like the pages of a forgotten diary, minarets casting long shadows, pigeons fluttering in sudden swarms over alleyways Abdul Hamid would have known by name. And as you sit up slowly, easing into another day of walking his legacy, it hits you. How strange that the man who lived in perpetual fear of exposure ended up becoming one of the most dissected, debated, and mythologized figures in Ottoman memory. This section, then, becomes your quiet reckoning with memory itself, not just the kind locked in archives, but the kind living in whispers, rituals, and inherited opinions. Because if the past is a mirror, Abdul Hamid's image in it depends entirely on who's holding the glass. You begin in a university lecture hall, where a professor with a thick beard and tired eyes is explaining to sleepy undergrads why Abdul Hamid matters. "He was the final firewall," he says, tapping the blackboard, "between East and West, between caliphate and collapse, between ideas we cling to and ones we pretend we don't miss." Some students nod, others roll their eyes. You scribble it down anyway. Because this isn't just a history lesson, it's a snapshot of the ideological tug-of-war Abdul Hamid still sparks. In modern Turkey and across the former Ottoman lands, his legacy has become a political Rorschach test. Conservatives revere him as the last legitimate Islamic ruler who stood against European imperialism, protected Muslim identity, and held the empire together with intelligence and will. Secularists, meanwhile, critique him as a paranoid autocrat whose suppression of dissent and rejection of constitutionalism strangled the empire's chance to reform from within. And for Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, and Arabs, especially those whose communities bore the brunt of his centralization, he's often remembered as the man whose order meant erasure. Yet, despite all this, you find his face everywhere, on posters in religious bookstores, in documentaries narrated in glowing tones, in quiet prayers whispered after Friday sermons. It's not just a resurgence, it's a reclaiming. For some, Abdul Hamid represents a lost dignity, a world where Islam and governance weren't treated as contradictions, a defiant stand before the age of oil deals, foreign mandates, and redrawn borders. You step into a conservative neighborhood mosque just before noon. The imam delivers a short talk after prayer, quoting the Sultan's famous line, "My people are the skin on my bones." The congregation murmurs approval. You catch the eye of a man in his 60s who tells you after a moment of silence, "My grandfather said there was discipline then. Respect. Not like now. People feared God." You nod, not to agree or disagree, but to receive the memory as it was given. Personal, layered, sacred. But of course, memory is never complete. You cross the city again to an older Armenian quarter. Here, you're met with quieter recollections. The bakery owner doesn't mention the Sultan at first. Only after some trust is built, after tea, after stories of migration and survival, does he say, "My great-grandmother used to say his name with a kind of shiver, like something cold had passed through the room." And again, you nod, because that too is a truth. You walk now through a cemetery, one of the older ones, where Ottoman script curls along tombstones like ivy. Among them is the modest grave of Abdul Hamid II, not far from other sultans, but not lionized either. A man tends the nearby flowers and tells you, "Many don't even know he's buried here, but they still argue about him on TV." And that, perhaps, is the final irony. For a man who so desperately sought control, his legacy is profoundly uncontrollable. He built institutions that were dismantled, promoted ideologies that were abandoned, created systems of governance that were either adapted or rejected outright. And yet his name endures, not as footnote, but as symbol. Some Turkish presidents have invoked him with admiration, comparing their battles with Western media or their emphasis on infrastructure to his. Others steer clear, wary of the ghosts his memory conjures. You open a recent book on Ottoman political thought. The chapter on Abdul Hamid begins bluntly. He did not go down fighting. He went down, calculating. And there's something to that. Unlike later figures who perished in war or exile, Abdul Hamid died quietly, in a palace on the Bosporus, surrounded by the silence of a dynasty that no longer ruled. He didn't ignite a civil war. He didn't flee. He simply vanished into history, leaving behind a trail of decisions,